Hello, and welcome to today's session on qualitative research design. This is where we will learn how to plan and structure our qualitative research effectively. Think of research design like planning to build a house. You need a good blueprint before you start construction. Today, we will cover how to structure your research project, choosing the right approach for your research question, making key decisions, and ensuring your research is both rigorous and practical. Let's start with a local business example. Suppose you want to understand how small businesses internally adapt to digital payment systems. How will you design that study? This example and many others will help us explore the key examples of qualitative research design as we proceed. Let's talk about research design in a way that makes practical sense. You know how every successful business starts with a solid business plan. Well, a research design is exactly like that, especially for your research project. Think of it as your research roadmap. Just like you wouldn't drive from Tamale to Accra without planning your route very well, you shouldn't start research without a clear plan. Your research proposal is like a business pitch. You are essentially saying to your supervisors, here is what I want to study, and here is how I will do it, and here is why it is worth doing. This is exactly what you are trying to say, or you are trying to communicate. Just like convincing investors about a business deal, the two are very similar. But here's something much more important, and I really want you to remember this. While you need a solid plan, you also need to be very flexible. It's like running a business. You have your strategy, but you may adjust it when the circumstances change. Maybe you discover something unexpected during your research, or maybe you discover a better approach may become clearer as you proceed with your research. And that's perfectly normal when conducting research. Let me give you an example. Say you are planning to study mobile money adoption among market traders. Your initial plan might be to conduct interviews, but once you start, you may realize that you need to also observe how they actually use the system in their daily lives. Now, let's talk about how you can generate a research idea before we come to choosing a topic. It is important that in choosing a topic, you may initially have research ideas. It is important that you understand how you can generate these research ideas and then later translate them into a research topic. Let's talk about finding your research idea. It's a bit like spotting a business opportunity. You don't just wake up one morning with a perfect idea. There are many ways to find inspiration, and generating research ideas are ways you can find some of these inspirations. Let's break this down with some practical examples. The first one is thinking and observing, or thinking and observation. You may ask yourself questions like what business problems you see in your community, which changes in the market intrigue you, and then maybe what makes you wonder why or how. Thinking about this can help you in generating your research idea. You may also consider past project work titles. And typically, you would find in our universities' libraries have gold mine of previous research work. You can go there and look at what others have done. You can try to consider what topics they covered, what gaps they left, and how you could build on their work. You could also use current events by following business news, watching the market trends, and then maybe noticing what's changing in the Ghanaian business environment. Maybe we can also use brainstorming as an example or as a way of generating research ideas. Let's do a quick brainstorming exercise. Think about the changes you have seen in local business over the past year in terms of new payment systems, changes in customers' behaviors, and maybe some business adaptations. Remember always to write down your ideas, even the ones that seem very small. Sometimes the best research ideas come from simple observations. Sometimes, too, in terms of generating research ideas, discussion may help. You can engage in this by talking to your mates, your classmates, maybe by talking to local business owners, by engaging or talking to your lecturers, and maybe sometimes by just engaging with even family members can help you in generating interesting and valuable research ideas. All right, after generating research ideas, the next thing I want us to talk about is choosing a topic. Let's talk about the 3 key ingredients for choosing your research topic. Think of it like setting up a business. You need the right combination of factors to be able to succeed. But most importantly, your interest in the topic is very paramount. It is absolutely very, very crucial. You'll be spending months on your research, so it is important to do something that you are generally excited about. For example, if you are fascinated by how small businesses use social media, that passion will keep you going when the research gets challenging. Second, finding the right supervisor. Just like you need a good mentor in business, you need the right supervisor for your research. We have faculty members with different expertise and different experience, some specializing in information systems, some in marketing, and some in finance. So make sure your topic aligns with the interests and expertise of your supervisor. One other critical thing you have to consider is data accessibility. This is a practical but vital consideration. Let's say you are interested in studying local market traders. The questions you should be asking yourself is, can you access these traders? Can you have access to them? Will they talk to you? Do you have ways to collect the data you need from them? Let me also give you a practical example. Suppose you are interested in mobile money adoption. You have to check if you are genuinely curious about it. Does it interest you? You also have to find out whether we have faculty studying financial technology. So the supervision, second issue, very critical. Then you also consider local businesses, whether local businesses will participate in your study. Will you be able to have access to the data? Next, I want us to talk about what makes a winning research topic. You know how first impressions matter in business? Well, it's the same thing. Your research topic is your first impression in academia. Let me break these 8 essential points for you. First, your topic needs to be very hot. Very hot means your topic should be what? Current. Something that people will care about, especially what people care about right now. The why. Because it is important that people are interested in your topic. Because also it is usually the first thing people will read your topic, and you want them to be hooked from the start. The second thing you have to consider is think of your topic like a business pitch. It needs to grab attention immediately and clearly show what problem you are talking about. The third thing is keep it short and sweet. At least you can keep it between 8 to 15 words. That should be your target, so that it will just be enough to show what you are doing and why it matters. Fourth, and this is also very important, do not use abbreviations. Use clear, positive language that gets people interested. It's like writing a compelling business proposal. Fifth, show the connections in your research. If you are studying how something affects something else, make that clear in your title. Six, don't waste words. Cut out phrases like a study of. Cut out stuff like that. They just take up space without adding value to your work. Seven, you have 2 choices. Make it a clear statement or an interesting question. Both may work well. So the 7th point is basically saying that you have 2 choices. You can just make your topic a statement, or you can make it an interesting question. Either way is fine. And then finally, remember the basics, proper grammar and proper capitalization. It seems obvious, but you may be surprised how many people usually slip up with this. So you may want to try crafting a topic, maybe with me or with your colleagues, to see how you can apply some of these techniques. Now, let's look at choosing a research topic. Before you can choose a research topic, you need a research problem. So I want to walk you through this cycle of finding a research problem. It's like a roadmap for starting your research journey. One, the first step, literature review and identifying the gaps. Very critical. Always try to start by reading what's already out there. For example, if you're interested in mobile money adoption, you have to read existing studies thoroughly. And these existing studies can be found in journal articles, it can be found in conference proceedings, and maybe some reports. And then try to find out what's missing in their findings. Two, generate research questions. Let's say you notice that whilst there's research on mobile money adoption in urban areas, there's little about it in rural markets. Now you can start asking questions like, how do rural traders adapt to mobile money? This is just an example. You may also ask a question like, what unique challenges do they face? How does it affect their business practices? Now, after this, the third important thing you also have to do is what I will refer to as literature check. Before getting too excited about your questions, you may have to go back to the literature and check again. Maybe someone has already answered the research questions you are trying to answer. And this can save you from duplicating existing research. Four, feasibility testing. You have to be practical here. One, can you access rural markets? Will the traders be willing to talk to you? Access to the data, very important. And you also have the time and the resources to be able to conduct this research. The fifth step I want us to look at is the elimination process. You may have to also try carefully to filter out questions that are too broad so that you can concentrate on the specifics. You may also have to filter out questions that lack access to data or filter out the need to many resources. Look at that carefully. Will you have access to resources to be able to conduct this research? And then the last step, the final check. Do you have a specific researchable problem? And the problem you are going to research on should be what? Properly grounded in the literature. Now, let's talk about the difference between research aims and objectives because these are tied to what we have discussed before. Think of it like planning a journey. Your research aim is very broad. It's your destination. Usually, we refer to it as the what you want to achieve. Whilst your objectives are like the specific stops along the journey, the specific stops along the way. And they usually refer to the how you will get there, the how you will get to your destination. Let's look at this example. Example one. Maybe if we have something like a clear aim about ICT and digital inclusion, we could have something like the aim is to examine effects of ICT on digital inclusion. And the objectives might be like maybe to analyze current ICT access patterns, to measure digital inclusion levels, and maybe to evaluate the relationship between access and inclusion. You can engage in similar examples. So maybe example two about governance. The aim may be to understand how governance affects disclosure, and the objectives could be to identify governance patterns, to measure disclosure practices, and maybe to analyze the relationship between them. You can practice with your own research ideas. Say, maybe, are you interested in maybe mobile money adoption? Your aim might be to understand how small businesses adapt to mobile money systems. And your objectives could be to identify adoption patterns, to examine challenges faced, and to assess impact on the business operations. Now, when you are dealing with research questions or maybe research objectives, you always have to apply the SMART test. And the SMART test specifically engages us to measure our research questions and research objectives against some criteria. It will help us ensure that our research is focused and what? And manageable. For instance, in terms of the SMART criteria or the SMART test, first, you need to be your questions, objectives need to be specific. So maybe instead of to study mobile money adoption, maybe we can put it this way in a better way to examine how small market traders in Tamale Central Market adapted their business practices to mobile money systems. We also have the second one, which refers to our objectives or questions being measurable. You could ask a question like this, and your answer to it will indicate whether your objectives or questions are measurable. For instance, what measures will you use to determine whether you have achieved your objectives? So your objectives should be measurable. You don't have to choose an objective which will be very difficult to measure. The next one is achievable. It should be, your research objective must be doable. That's just basically what it says. Your research objective should also be very realistic. Realistic in the sense that you have to consider the constraints you may be faced with. Then also timeliness. Will you have the time to accomplish all your objectives in the time frame you have set? For instance, if you are on a master's program, usually the duration for the dissertation or thesis are limited. So you don't have to go and choose objectives or questions that will take you more than the duration allocated for you to conduct the research. Let's talk about the research problem in a way that makes some practical sense. Now, you know how businesses identify market problems before creating solutions? Research works almost the same way. A research problem is like spotting a gap in the market. It involves seeing something that needs to be understood or solved. Now, we can break this down using local examples. For instance, we can consider these factors when choosing your problem or coming up with your research problem. The first is the interest. Is this something you are genuinely curious about? It's very important. Example, maybe you have noticed how different generations of traders adapt to mobile money differently. But apart from the interest, you may also have to consider the magnitude. The magnitude basically involves you asking yourself this question: is this problem significant enough to warrant me spending this amount of time and resources to pursue? So, for example, asking a question like, how many businesses or people does this issue affect? The third one is measurement. A measurement already featured in our SMART principle or test. Now, in terms of measurement, you have to ask yourself, can you actually study this? If your study involves some construct, how are these constructs going to be measured? Also consider your expertise level. Do you have or can you develop the needed knowledge to be able to conduct this research? The fifth one is the issue of what? Of relevance. And you have to ask the question whether this particular issue matters to the business community. Is it important? 6, data availability. The availability of data is very important. You should be asking yourself, this topic that I have chosen to pursue, can you get the information or the data you need? And last but not the least, ethical issues. You have to consider whether the study you are going to conduct can be conducted without causing any harm. Usually when we are dealing with a research problem, the research problem usually tries to tell us what lies in between what should be happening and what is actually or currently happening. That in between issue is what we refer to as the research problem, the problem statement. And when we consider these factors, our problem or research problem can be turned in a way that we'll be making progress in our research. Now, let me take some time to explain theoretical framework using some everyday business examples and how it can support us in terms of generating our ideas, in terms of our research topic and conducting our research. Think about how you might study mobile money adoption in local markets. You can approach it basically in 2 ways. The first way you can approach it is by using what we refer to as inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is usually used when a researcher starts bottom up, and after collecting data, they start to use the data to build a theory. Whilst deductive reasoning is where a researcher starts top down. The researcher begins with a theory and then collects data to do what? To test it. Now, in terms of the first one, inductive reasoning, which is the bottom up, you start by observing using the mobile money adoption example, studying mobile money adoption in local markets. We can use inductive reasoning by, first of all, observing traders using mobile money and then collecting stories and the experiences of the users. When we do that, we may notice patterns, and eventually we can build a theory about how adoption happens. Usually this happens like we can compare it to being something like being a market researcher who observes customers and then develops insights about the customer's what behavior. The second scenario is a deductive reasoning, which we would refer to as the top-down approach. Here, you start with existing theories about maybe technology adoption. You test if these theories work in our local markets. You collect data to prove or disprove the theory. This is more or less like when a business applies an established business model to see if it works locally. Let's look at another example in terms of inductive reasoning. You observe how different traders may use mobile money, notice patterns in terms of adoption, develop new theories about local business technology adoption. However, when we are looking at it in the context of deductive reasoning, you start with known theories about digital payment adoption in the literature. Then we test it to see if they apply to our local market context, and then we can confirm or modify the existing theory. What you have to notice is that both approaches are valid. You might even use both in the same study. Okay. Yes, so this slide also explains the concept of deductive and inductive reasoning we have talked about. Okay. Now, in this slide, I want us to talk about the core issue in this lecture or session. In this slide, we're going to talk about something really important in the research world, the research design. Now, to think about the research design, I will want you to think of it as your game plan for tackling your research project. The game plan for tackling your research project. Now, we can use the scenario of building a house to explain this. You know, before building a house, architects need detailed blueprints. Well, research design is exactly like that. But for your research project, but in this case, it is for your research project. The research design is your roadmap that helps you to get from your initial question to your final findings without getting lost along the way. Let's break down what goes into it. First are your philosophical assumptions. Basically, how do you view the world? And how do you believe? And how can your belief help you understand the world? This might sound a bit heavy now, but it actually shapes everything else we would be doing. Then there's your research methods. The research method basically is the strategy. The research method basically is the strategy. This strategy is what you use to investigate your research questions and achieve your research objectives. Then there's also data collection. This is where you will have to figure out how you will gather your data. Maybe you may be conducting interviews, you may be distributing questionnaires, or maybe you may just be observing people. Then there's also the stage where you would have to analyze the data and then finally write up your piece. So a research design basically follows this particular roadmap. So let's look at what makes up a solid qualitative research design. I just love how this model shows us the model of building a house, which I have used already. You start with the foundation and you work your way up. This is a typical example of a research design. Now, let's start with the philosophical assumptions. These are your basic beliefs about how we can understand the world around us. And as a researcher, this can guide you in terms of your worldview. Think of it like choosing your lens through which you would view your research. Are you looking at how people construct their social reality, or maybe how power structures influence behavior, and many, many more? This is where you will actually lay the groundwork for your research. The next up in terms of the research design are the research methods. Building on those assumptions, the philosophical assumptions, you may have to pick your research strategy. Maybe you may use ethnography to really immerse yourself in a particular community, or perhaps you can use case studies to get deep insights into specific situations. Your methods or your research methods needs to align with the philosophical assumptions you have made, because they usually work together. The next thing up is the data collection technique. Now we are getting a bit practical here. This is where you decide how you will actually gather your data. Will you be conducting in-depth interviews? Maybe you may be doing participant observation, or maybe focus groups. The technique you choose needs to match both your research method and your philosophical approach. Next up is the data analysis approach. Once you've got all that rich qualitative data, the question you should be asking is, how will you make sense of it? You might use thematic analysis to spot patterns in the data, or you may use narrative analysis to understand people's stories. This is where you turn all those interviews and observations into meaningful insights. When you have done all this, this is the final product, the written work. This is the stage at which you write up. This is the final product where it all comes together. But notice how it sits at the top when you look at this model. That is because how you plan to present your findings actually influences everything below it. Are you writing for an academic journal? Are you writing a thesis? Is it a policy brief? This shapes how you approach everything else. The beauty of this model is how each level builds on the one below it. It's all connected in a way. And those arrows going up shows us how each decision influences the next step. Now, the last thing I want us to consider is I want to help you understand what goes into writing a solid research proposal in a way that is easy to follow. Think of a research proposal as telling a compelling story about your research project. Here's how each piece fits together. First up is your title. And we spoke about title earlier. This is your project's first impression. Make it clear, engaging, and specific enough so that people immediately would know what you are investigating. Next is the abstract. The abstract is just like a movie trailer. Short but powerful summary that gives readers the big picture of what you are planning to do. You may have to pack all the key points in about 250 words or so. Next up is your introduction. This is where you hook your readers. What's the problem you are tackling? Why should anyone care? This is where you make your case for why your research matters, why your research is important. Now, the next thing is the literature review. The literature review shows you have done your homework. What have others discovered about your topic? What gaps exist in the current knowledge? And this set up why your research is needed and why your research is what is important. Okay? Your topic needs to be clearly defined, not just I want to study stress, but something specific like how do remote workers manage work-life balance during maybe global crisis. The next thing I want you to look at is a theoretical framework. The theoretical framework is your research backbone, because you cannot write without theories. What theories or concepts will guide your research or your investigation? This can help readers understand how you are approaching the problem. Next up is the research methods. The research methods, as I've already indicated, is your game plan. It explains exactly how you would conduct your study. Will you be doing interviews? Will you be doing focus group observations? And you have to be very specific about your approach. For qualitative data analysis, you have to detail how you would make sense of all the information or the data you are gathering. Will you use thematic analysis? Will you use narrative analysis? Will you use content analysis or hermeneutics? Then next up is the timeline. The timeline shows that you have thought through the logistics carefully. For instance, when will each phase happen? You have to indicate. And this will demonstrate that you have got a realistic plan to complete your work. And then finally, your references. Your references show the scholarly conversation you are joining. Make sure they are recent, they are relevant, and properly formatted. Each of these elements works together to create a complete picture of your planned research. I say planned research because it is what? A proposal. It's like putting together puzzle pieces. Each one is very, very essential in order to see the whole picture. This brings us to the end of the session on research design. Thank you.